Bible contains over 2,000 verses concerned with poverty, and there's a strong theme throughout the Bible about our riches and our poverty. If we've been Christians for a while or have read the Bible, we know this stuff. And yet with so much of the Word of God, we find this so confronting, and it speaks truth into all sorts of situations we find ourselves in here and now. So in UNO, we wanted to visit the Bible's teaching on poverty in one brief, broad sweep. This is one talk of a series of 4. Poverty and God's law, poverty and the prophets, poverty and the Messiah, and poverty and the early church.
Let's begin today with just a little about poverty in the biblical context. So who are we talking about when we talk about the poor? Certainly, when the Bible mentions the poor, it's referring to those who, for various reasons, struggle to meet their basic needs. But the biblical connotations include a broader understanding too, and that is of someone who was unable to live as God intended because they were oppressed or they were disenfranchised. Those who are suffering on the underside of society, unable to escape their disadvantage because of the power structures at play. Now, let's take a moment to imagine their faces. The sick who were cast away, unable to work, despised. Migrants who had left their homelands and were reliant upon hospitality, vulnerable. Women who were widowed or childless with very few options, the subject of violence, voiceless. Now these are just some of the faces of the poor in the Bible. So today's topic is about God's heart for the poor as revealed in the Old Testament law. But we'll be looking at it through the lens of the man who fulfilled the law, and that is Jesus, highlighted by an account in Mark 14 verses 3 to 9. Let's get straight into the text. Now, while Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of costly aromatic oil made from pure nard. After breaking open the jar, she poured it on his head, but some who were present indignantly said to one another, "Why this waste of expensive ointment? It could have been sold for more than 300 silver coins and the money given to the poor." So they spoke very angrily to her, and Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a good service for me. For you will always have the poor with you, and you can do good for them whenever you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She anointed my body beforehand for burial. And I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her."
A few things to notice right off the bat. First of all, this whole scene takes place in a leper's house. Considering lepers were not able to work normal jobs or be part of society, this is almost certainly a very poor person, in a very poor home on the margins of a town called Bethany. Of all the people he could spend his time with, Jesus leads his disciples to the poorest, most isolated people, and at great personal cost. It's very likely he was only recently healed, or not yet at this point, meaning everyone is now ceremonially unclean just for entering the house and eating with Simon, barring them from participating in the biggest religious event of the year, which is the Passover. Second, we do not know this woman's background. Many suppose she was a prostitute, as nard would have been a tool of the trade. Alternatively, she could have also simply been a wealthy woman. But in either case, socioeconomic barriers, gender codes, and purity laws were being violated just by her presence, and further by the act of touching Jesus. In his account, Mark intentionally draws attention to the many Old Testament laws and codes of conduct being broken by Jesus in the process of lifting up poor and marginalized individuals. So we continue with the story. The woman proceeds to break open this jar, indicating she no longer intends to keep a store of these riches, and anoints Jesus' head with fragrant oil. The disciples yell at her for her wasteful act of adoration, to which Jesus responds in his ever clever way, "Leave her alone. She has done a good service for me. For you will always have the poor with you, and you can do good for them whenever you want." Let's take a moment to reflect on this response. How do we typically interpret this response?
At 24 years old, I had just joined Urban Neighbours of Hope and was moving from my hometown in Perth to Melbourne, 3,400 kilometres away. from my family, to move into a poor community and work with Burmese refugees, isolated new arrivals and youth there. Now, coincidentally, sitting next to me on the plane was a young pastor. We struck up a conversation and he asked why I was headed to our destination. When I shared about my vision and UNO's commitment to the poor, his response felt definitive and defensive. Well, the Bible says that you always have the poor with you, and we're not all called to the poor. Like in this pastor's response, this one little verse, Jesus' own words, has often been used to dismiss any obligations to lay down our own comfort, resources, time, or energy for the poor in following Jesus. On one hand, we may interpret the passage by saying, "Well done, woman, you lavished everything on worshipping and adoring Jesus. So it's okay that you didn't give to the poor. Therefore, as long as we are extravagant in our worship of Jesus, it's perfectly fine if we are not caring for the needy in our own community." On the other hand, we may interpret by focusing on good stewardship, saying, look, the poor are always going to be an issue in our society, so it's not the wisest, most sustainable, most efficient use of personal or church funds to throw at the never-ending problem of poverty. But I don't think either of these interpretations are what Jesus intended. So let's take a deep dive into his response, shall we?
What's easy to miss in this response is that Jesus is directly quoting the Old Testament. He uses a rhetorical device where only part of the verse is quoted, but the rest of the verse is assumed or brought to mind. We see Jesus doing this on the cross as well. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Which would have brought to mind the uncannily prophetic Psalm 22. We do this today too. For example, I might remind a child, "Do unto others," which assumes as you would have them do unto you. Or maybe say, "For God so loved the world," leaving out the rest of John 3:16 because it's implied and easily recalled. Here Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 15 verse 11, which says, "There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." Now, the Old Testament laws had two main concerns, which you might have guessed are how to love God, that is, how to honor, worship, please, and relate to God. How to love others, how to treat others, reflect his character of justice and mercy, resolve conflict, and so on. But importantly, where it came to the poor and disadvantaged, the laws explicitly sought to restrain the powerful and protect the weak. This particular verse that Jesus quotes is set in the broader chapter regarding the cancellation of debts and the freeing of bondservants every 7 years, which was meant to prevent families from falling into unlimited generational poverty at the hands of their wealthier neighbors. The chapter further warns against being stingy in lending to the poor, when you know outstanding debts will be forgiven at the next sabbatical year. And this is just one of many commandments designed to protect and care for the poor. We see other similar laws, such as the year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25, which meant land could only be leased, not sold permanently. And every 50 years, it was supposed to be released back to the familial owners. The same concept applied for indentured service, Israelites who sold themselves as slaves due to hardship. They were released in the year of Jubilee. All this prevented poorer families from permanently losing their inheritance, their capital, their livelihoods, because they fell on hard times. And it prevented wealthy families from monopolizing all of the land. Some of these laws would be particularly helpful in Thailand right now, honestly. Many of our neighbors moved to Bangkok penniless and in search of work. They were farmers who had fallen on a few bad crops and in turn permanently lost their families' farmlands to the big agricultural companies. This plunged them into even deeper generational poverty.
This is not how God intended them to live, and this is not what his kingdom on earth looks like. In fact, the Father's heart is for there to be no poor or needy in his kingdom at all. We see this clearly in Deuteronomy 15 verses 4 to 5. There should not be any poor among you, for the Lord will surely bless in the land that he is giving you as an inheritance, if you carefully obey him by keeping all these commandments that I am giving you today. Some of the laws he's talking about are ones that secured housing for the disadvantaged, championed good labor conditions, and ensured legal protection for the orphan, widow, and alien. Deuteronomy 14 required periodic tithes of one's harvests and livestock be given to provide for the Levites, priests, and local poor, essentially starting the first food bank. Now, interestingly, one beautiful thing about Thai culture is that people will wake up early to purchase or make food to offer to Buddhist monks. These monks walk barefooted along the road, blessing people as they make their rounds from the local temple. The offering of food feeds the monks who have no income, but also serves the community. And because the monks always collect more than they are able to eat, needy people from the community can go and get a free meal from the temple when they want. Wouldn't it be amazing if the church and followers of Jesus were known for meeting such practical needs in the community?
What about Deuteronomy 24, which protected the wages of poor day laborers and put limitations on collateral that could be exacted from a poor person? For example, if all they had was the clothes on their back, the collateral could be their cloak. But it was the responsibility of the money lender to go out of their way to bring back that cloak each night, so that the borrower didn't freeze. Meanwhile, Deuteronomy 23 prevented the charging of interest altogether, which could so easily keep people enslaved to debt. In the slum where we work, it's not uncommon for loan sharks to offer loans at 10% interest per day. That means a $1,000 loan would require a daily payment of $100 to keep the life-threatening collectors at bay until the principal was paid in full by lump sum. They don't allow gradual repayment. Leviticus 23 prevented farmers from over-harvesting their field, which they had worked hard to cultivate, in order that the hungry, as well as migrants who had no land, could glean and not starve.
Through these examples and more, we see God's heart for society to have just laws that restrain the powerful, protect the vulnerable, and provide for those in need. He wanted his people to be generous, to be personally invested in caring for the poor, and to prevent others from falling into unbreakable cycles of poverty, even if it came at a cost to their personal wealth. And if the Israelites had done that and followed these laws, there shouldn't have actually been any poor. Of course, mankind continues to be self-serving, which is why 6 verses later we find the verse Jesus is referencing.
So what was Jesus communicating when he responds to his nagging disciples with, "You will always have the poor with you"? Well, first, he goes on to say, "And you can do good for them whenever you want." Jesus blatantly disregarded the purity laws around leprosy. He boldly disregarded gender codes by affirming this woman's presence and actions. But here, instead of also disregarding this Old Testament commandment, he upholds it. He says essentially, yes, that's right. My disciples are to continue to care for and be open-handed towards the poor, even in my absence. That is the given. That is the rule. This is an exception.
He goes on to say, "But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She anointed my body beforehand for burial." Keep in mind, Jesus was poor, so in reality this woman had given generously of her resources in order to bless a poor, homeless man. But beyond that, this woman, whether knowingly or by the Spirit's leading, had eyes to see something that was going on behind the scenes. Something that was specific to a particular time and place in this epic story. Never again would Jesus' body need to be anointed for burial. It was a unique exception. But the poor would continue to need loving kindness and generosity.
Brothers and sisters, in the same way, let us not forget the given, the rule, the greater theme of God's heart for the poor and marginalized as expressed through the law and confirmed through Jesus' life and ministry. It is so easy for us to see this verse, "For you will always have the poor with you," as a prophecy about the fixed state of the world. But I think Jesus would have seen this as a challenge to walk in his ways, for us to personally respond to poverty and oppression in our community, even in his absence. A challenge to, as a church, bring about God's vision from Deuteronomy 15, that there should not be any poor among you. An invitation to hope that just maybe our actions can bring heaven a little closer to earth for those most in need right here, right now. For our family, we have responded to that challenge by relocating to a poor community, seeking the best interests of our new neighbors, and caring for people on the fringe of society. Maybe that's not for you. After all, our young pastor friend on the plane was partially right. Not everyone is called to relocate to a poor community. However, Jesus and the Old Testament show us that everyone is called to respond to that challenge, to follow him in living out God's heart for the poor. May we all have the courage to receive more of that heart.